Hello everyone. This week you will notice we're going to take a pretty significant shift from where we have been to where we are going, which is straight into the Greek. So, a few things I want to say before we jump into the content for this week. First thing you're going to notice is that this is an 8-page document for the lecture. What I really want to emphasize for you this week is that you don't think this is something you need to memorize somehow. That is not the purpose of this course. I hope you've seen that with the open book nature of most of the things I'm having you do. In fact, what I assume is that when you have access to this kind of material, you're going to use it more, and then by using it more, it'll actually become more intuitive for you when you encounter certain things that you've seen before. So I expect you to have this at your side at all times so that you can reference it to interpret what you're looking at in your English Bibles and then hopefully eventually in your Greek New Testaments. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the basic things that you learned about nouns and we're going to translate them into the Greek language. So what we had talked about in week 1 was the subject, direct object, indirect object, and possessive functions of the nouns in English. So now what we're going to do is we're going to translate that into Greek. So you'll notice here a subject in Greek is called the nominative case. The direct object is called the accusative, the indirect, the dative, and the possessive is called the genitive case. So what we're going to do now is as we're reading through the Greek or through our English Bibles, it's actually going to tell you when it's translating a word in Greek that's in one of these cases if it's a noun. And what's below this are all the different ways that you can interpret those cases depending on the context. So I'm going to walk you through really quickly, because I want to keep this under 15 minutes. I'm going to walk you through really quickly the basics of each of these 4 different cases. Okay, so we're going to start with the nominative, which is really the simplest of the 3. And technically, these are all ways that we use subject or nominative nouns in English as well. So the first is as the subject. This is what we've already learned and what we've been dealing with. Now, where it gets a little bit more nuanced is that the nominative case, when it's found in sentences with to be verbs, which are generally called equative, it can also appear as the object of the sentence because really the subject and the object are interchangeable. So you could say the boy is Derek, Derek is the boy. Either way, it's the same. So in Greek, they would notate that by simply putting them both as the subject case or the nominative case. In this particular instance, and this actually becomes important with John chapter 1, the Word became God and the Word was God. There's some interesting things going on there with the predicate nominative that are important for the Jehovah's Witness argument, but that's another class. So here, just know that sometimes the nominative case can appear as the subject and the object if there's only a to be verb present. Okay, and then simple apposition. This is when a noun is just identifying a previous noun in a more specific way. This often happens at the beginning of Paul's letters when he says, I, Paul, apostle. So those are all going to appear in the nominative, and the first one is I. That's a pronoun. That's the subject of the sentence in the nominative case. Then Paul will also be nominative, but it will be renaming the I. It's telling you what the I is. That's called simple apposition. All right, and we'll see a few examples of that here and there. All right, so that's the easiest one. Then we're going to get into genitive. These are more difficult, but they're also a lot more fun. So the simple way that we've been talking about the genitive case is in possessive terms. So I give you a few examples here. The slave of the high priest, in other words, the high priest's slave, or the people of God, which you could then interpret as God's people. Those are clear instances where the words high priest and God are in the genitive case to show possession of the previous noun listed in the sentence. Okay. Then we get a little bit more nuanced. And we actually do this all the time in English. You'll notice that the common preposition used with the genitive case is of. You'll see of a lot. We use of all the time in extremely generic ways, but we just make sense of it because we know the context. The Greek language is no different. They would have just put something in the genitive case, and then the context for the readers would determine how they understood it. We don't have that luxury because it's not our native language, so we have to try to delineate what the authors meant. So, for instance, the descriptive genitive. When someone says, John was preaching a baptism of repentance, that doesn't mean that it's a baptism that belongs to repentance, but rather it's a baptism that's described by repentance or characterized by. You'll notice that I give you here in the lecture a few words that you can replace the word of with to see if they work, and that's how you'll determine what you think it's functioning as in the sentence. Okay, the other example I give here, let us put on weapons of light. These aren't light's weapons, they are weapons that are characterized by light. Okay, that one's fairly simple. The partitive genitive, this is could be replaced by which is part of or among. Half of my possessions, that is half among my possessions, the poor among the saints. So the poor of the saints, or the poor which are part of the saints, is how you would understand that. It's telling you a part of a whole. So the whole is the saints, the poor is a part of the saints. Okay. The genitive of material, this is telling you what one noun is made out of. So a patch of unshrunk cloth can then be interpreted as a patch made out of or consisting of unshrunk cloth. So a literal translation might just say of. You would need to put in the words made of or consisting of. Okay. A genitive of content. This is usually easy to see because the word full will likely be present, but if it's not, it'll just say something like the net of fish. So you could say the net containing fish or full of fish, something like that, to nuance what that genitive, how that genitive is functioning. The genitive of separation switches from the standard preposition of and uses away or away from. Shake the dust of your feet is literally what it says in Matthew 10:14, but we translate it as shake the dust away from or off of or from your feet. The genitive of comparison, so it would literally in Matthew 6:25 say something like, is not your life worth more of food? And here you would have to say more than food. It's pretty clear in the context that will be the case, at least the context that I will be giving you in this class. Now we get to the subjective and objective genitive, and I don't have a ton of time to explain this, but you'll practice this in your homework actually, if not your worksheet. It might be your worksheet, one of the two, this week. The subjective and objective genitives are tricky because they're used when there is a noun that has some sort of verbal quality. So, for instance, the noun love implies action, and so oftentimes there will be what is called a subjective or an objective genitive. And this is the easiest one that I've given you here for both of these. So in Romans 8:35, who shall separate us from the love of Christ is what it will often say in your translations. But many scholars would argue that is a subjective genitive, and what it's saying is more explicitly, who shall separate us from the love displayed by Christ? That makes more explicit what that of means in the sentence, because it's actually not necessarily the case. It could also be an objective genitive, which would be, who shall separate us from the love displayed for Christ? Now, in that context, we could probably say it's probably not that someone's separating us from the love we show to Christ, but rather that no one can separate us from the love that Christ is showing for us, right? But in cases like Luke 11:42, you have neglected justice and love of God is the literal translation. But the more likely implication is it's you have neglected justice and showing some sort of love to God. So love displayed for or shown for God. These can be really tricky to delineate, and you'll have plenty of practice because they're extremely important in a lot of debates that are going on in the scholarly world, and they make a lot of difference in a lot of Pauline documents for translation. The genitive of time and relationship, I'm going to give you, I'm just going to let you go over those. They're pretty straightforward. The one thing I do want to point out is that, and I'll show you how to do this in the tutorial before you do your homework. If there is some sort of preposition that comes that's a separate word from the genitive case, then it can actually throw this all off, and all you have to do for your answers is that it's a genitive that's the object of a preposition. Okay, and that goes for the dative and the accusative as well. All right, so I'm going to quickly go over the dative, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, primarily because after I've gone over the genitive, the dative is going to be the same thing, just with different kinds of categories. And so when you get into your homework, I'm going to show you actually how to filter your logos or your accordance to show you all the occurrences of genitive nouns and all the occurrences of dative nouns in the passage you're studying. And then what you can do is you can go through and you can decide how each of them function just by going through this list. Okay, so just as I went over the genitive, there's some stuff here in the dative. The standard way is as an indirect object, as we've already learned to discern in English. The dative of sphere simply uses the preposition in, and it means something like in the sphere of. So the poor, in the realm of, or the sphere of the spirit. A dative of means is the means by which something is accomplished. So he cast out spirits by means of or with a word, as though he's using it as a tool. So she wiped his feet with her hair. A dative of advantage is something you can replace with the word for the advantage of or for the sake of. So instead of just saying for if you forgive others their trespasses, here it's more likely for if you forgive for the sake of others their trespasses. In other words, it's to the advantage of the dative noun that this action that this verbal action is happening. I like to use for the advantage or for the sake of to make that more clear. The dative of reference can be said as something like the churches grew with reference to faith, or in is too generic. Something like with reference to gives a little bit more meat to it. Romans 6:2, how shall we who died with reference to sin still live? Okay. So this, you could even argue that should be, how shall we who have died in the realm of sin, right? I've included it here as a dative of reference, but perhaps it's a dative of sphere. This is where you actually have to make some interpretive decisions and argue for your point in the class, okay? So it can be a little bit fun if you want to have some fun with it. The other ones, much like the genitive, I'm just going to skate over here. The dative of possession, time, and association. The cognate dative will be pretty clear because they'll just repeat words. I'll let you go over that by yourself, but once again, remember, and I'll show you how to do this in the tutorial video. If you see a separate preposition as a word in the text, then the dative is going to be the object of that preposition, and I'll show you how to identify that. Okay. Finally, you have the accusative, and actually here, this can get a little funky, and we're not going to deal too much with it in this class because the genitives and datives have too much interpretive importance, but we will have a few places where you can practice interpreting your accusatives, and we'll go over those in class, I'll go over those in the review of the worksheet and homework for you, so you understand if those pop up and you're not getting them correct. I'll clarify those for you, but you can kind of go over the different ways that accusative works. The primary way you're going to see an accusative is simply as a direct object. There will be a few places where there's what's called a double accusative, and then you can just decide between the two options that are given to you here, a person, thing, or object complement, by reading the descriptions. So I know it's a lot. use it as a reference sheet. Don't try to memorize it. Do the best you can. This is where grace will abound with the homework and the worksheets, because this is just a lot of information for you to digest, and I'm very aware of that. So don't feel too much pressure. Take a shot at it. Watch the tutorial and just dive in and have some fun with the biblical text, and we'll debrief later.